Buying a home can be a rewarding experience and a good financial step in the right direction, but it's also a pretty daunting experience. There's a lot of new information thrown at you, a ton of paperwork to sign, and it's not like there's anything in life, like a class taught in school, for example, that prepares you for this. So I'm going to give some advice from my own personal experience, but ultimately everybody's experience differs slightly because everybody's in a different stage in life or has a different financial situation. Now, a lot of the advice I'm going to share doesn't necessarily just apply to a younger age group. It could be pretty much applied to anybody, including first-time home buyers or even if you're buying a second home. But to start, what I would say is if you're in that specific age group from 18 to say 25 or even 26, that age group does have its own vulnerabilities and risks that they kind of have these blind spots when it comes to buying their first home that they need to be aware of. First off, if you are in this age group and thinking about buying a home, congratulations to you because it obviously took a lot of financial discipline to be able to save for that down payment for a home. But at the same time, that can also lead to a lot of arrogance and believing that you don't necessarily have to take advice from anybody else. I'll actually share my own personal experience so that way you can take away some advice and lessons and learn from my own mistakes. But to give some background, when I was younger, we grew up in a household that didn't necessarily have a lot, single mother, multiple siblings type situation. So as a kid, I was always driven to, find ways to make income and save money as much as possible. We spent our Saturdays clipping coupons and stuff like that. And luckily, through enough hustle and working on side jobs when I was in school, by the time I turned 18, I actually had enough money to pay for a down payment. But essentially, I was in a position to buy a home, and I had just completed my first year in college, and I was making enough side money that I thought about it that if I worked full time, I could not only pay for a home, but I also could afford, a little bit of extra savings on top of that. So I kind of thought about, why do I necessarily need college or anything like that? And the area I lived at, you could actually find a pretty decent home that was in the $80,000 to $120,000 range for a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom house. And, of course, that was a number of years ago. But the point being is, I thought it was a great idea. So I went through the whole entire process, got pre-approved, gathered all the tons of information that they ended up needing. And, at the very end of it all, just almost kind of on a whim, I just decided, this isn't for me. I don't want to work full time at this company that I'm working at. And so, I just stopped the process altogether. This brings me to my first point and the biggest mistake that I was making at the time, which is that a home purchase, is a pretty big deal. It's a huge commitment. And once you commit to buying a home, everything in life becomes a million times harder as far as making these life decisions. If you want to move cities, if you're living in New York, for example, and you want to move to Florida, that is not as easy to do as if you were living in an apartment. Once you have a home, you start to worry about things as far as, you care about job security. You need to make sure you're making those mortgage payments. And so it's a really big commitment. And when you're younger, you don't necessarily have the context in mind. Even if you're 29 years old, the average length of a mortgage is, 30 years, which is longer than you've been alive. So that just kind of puts into context how big of a commitment a house is. Even if you're planning on staying at home just for like 5 years, for example, the recommendation usually is that you shouldn't buy a home if you're not planning on staying longer than 5 years, or some people even say 3 years. And the reason being is that the closing costs and, you're also opening up risk to selling the home at the wrong time. So the whole point being is you should stay at a home at least 5 years. But even if you were staying there 5 years and you're also fairly young and you just started your career, typically you haven't even worked enough years to really even understand the scope of how long 5 years really is when you just started working a job. It's a lot longer when you're working a repetitive job year after year versus, when you're in school and you have summer breaks and stuff like that. So it's definitely a consideration when you're thinking about buying a home. Now, eventually I did buy a home by the time I turned 22, but even looking back, there's still a lot of mistakes I did make. For example, I didn't even necessarily ask a lot of people that I was close with, like close friends or family, what is their input or overall thoughts on getting a home? Is there anything I should look out for? And I think the two main reasons that kind of happened is, one, just being overly eager, but two, just kind of a misplaced trust in certain key people. Now, I'm not necessarily saying this applies across the board 100% to everybody, but in general, you have to understand that a realtor and a mortgage lender and pretty much everybody that works in the real estate industry has a strong incentive to get you to buy a home as quickly as possible and basically at the top of your budget. So that means that everybody's going to kind of push you to gloss over things that you may actually care to learn more in depth about. This is just a personal example, but when I was buying my own home, there was a crack in the driveway that wasn't too much of a gap, but it was something I noticed. But at the same time, when I was a kid, I remember playing in driveways all the time that had plenty of cracks and never bothered me. So when the realtor noticed that I was paying attention to it, she kind of just said, it's, a small crack, not that big of a deal, probably something you could fix down the road pretty easily. And I just kind of took her at her word and didn't do any more research on that. But it wasn't until later on that I started to kind of think differently. Now that I'm a homeowner, you start to think about liabilities. Maybe someone can trip on that. Or you start to think about, curb value. You start to think about the fact that grass can grow into that little crevice and kind of make your driveway look ugly. Those are things that before I was a homeowner, I never necessarily cared about. And now you wouldn't think about that as a young homeowner or a first-time home buyer for sure. And on top of that, as a young person looking to buy a home, you kind of have no perspective on how much things cost. I had a general sense of, an AC unit for the typical home I was looking at could cost anywhere from $4,000 to $6,000, or how much a roof replacement costs. But there's so many things you have to consider when you're buying a house. How much does it cost to replace a fence? That would shock a lot of people. How much to build a deck in your backyard? That would shock a lot of people. There's so many different things to consider that at face value you think it's not going to be that expensive. Couldn't be more than $1,000, to take out a tree, for example. But then you find out some places cost, $2,000, $3,000 just to cut down a tree. Those are things that are really beneficial for a prospective buyer to really understand and learn, especially because it can help you negotiate a better price on your house. And I did use some of these things to my leverage, but I probably would have pushed even further had I known, that a crack in the driveway would cost a couple $1,000s to replace the whole entire driveway. So that's definitely to your benefit to understand, the different costs of different repairs. The last little piece of advice I want to give to first-time home buyers, and on top of that, especially young home buyers, is that you have to kind of pace yourself and don't get overly eager. Buying a house can be a daunting experience, but it's also a pretty thrilling experience as well. You start to picture how you can decorate things. You start to think about, how you would change up a certain space, and it starts to get exciting. You envision yourself living in that home, so you kind of get attached to a home before you even buy it. And then what happens is you put an offer in for a house and they don't necessarily accept your offer, and you lose up on that opportunity, and you start to kind of almost over-idealize the past or over-idealize the house. It's kind of a bias that humans have. And so you start to think, man, that house was so perfect, everything was great about it, and now I lost up on that opportunity. So when there's another house, a new house that you're interested in, you don't want to take any chances. You give them their asking price or even above asking price, and you're just go as far as trying to get that new home. But what you have to really understand is that there's always going to be more houses out there. There's plenty of houses that are going to be on the market. It may take a few months, or maybe even currently there's a few houses in your area that are available. So you have to understand that, and you also have to understand that no house is truly 100% perfect. You're going to change things when you end up buying a house. You're going to rearrange things, and there's going to be things that kind of drive you nuts, and it may be a little small thing. But the whole point, the reason that's important to recognize, is then you truly understand that, I'm trying to put an offer in this house, but the value is not there. And so, it's not the perfect house, and I'll probably find another house that's comparable. So this happens to a lot of, first-time home buyers. So don't necessarily beat yourself up if this happens to you, but it is something to be aware of if you haven't bought your first house. And especially because a lot of people, and I tell people this all the time, and they almost kind of don't believe me on this, you will find yourself, just talking to a realtor, just trying to get a general sense in January, maybe you're going to buy a house in October, that's your target time. And so you just start asking questions in January just to kind of plan ahead, or maybe you talk to a mortgage lender just to see how much house you could actually afford. And then 3 months later, it's March and April around there, and you're already moving into a house, and you're just, it kind of flashes before your eyes. And once again, that kind of goes back to that point that everybody has a strong incentive in that industry to just push you forward and quickly get you to buy a house. At the end of the day, I hope this advice can at least help one or two people out there, but hopefully it can help a lot more people out there. But in general, for everybody buying a home, there's always going to be lessons afterwards. You're always going to look back, and I actually think that's a good thing. If you're buying a home and you think you did everything 100% perfect, I actually would kind of question that mentality. But in general, you just kind of have to accept it's a learning curve, it's a learning experience, but there's plenty of advice out there that can be given so that way you don't have to learn the hard way. And if you have any questions about buying a home for the first time, leave a comment down below, and I'd be more than happy to give give my perspective on that. Or leave a comment down below if you have bought your first home and what that experience was like and any lessons or takeaways you had from that experience. I'd be curious what everybody else has to share. So that's it for this video. If you found this video useful at all, please give it a thumbs up. And if you like personal finance or anything business related or economics related, I post a video pretty much every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and sometimes on Saturdays as well. So please hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for more.